Okay, our next speaker asks a very big question. In fact, two big questions. How do we get to where we are today? And what's next? Imants Kins is co-chair of Australians for Northern Development and Economic Vision, and a highly experienced economist with a background spanning government, the private sector and board-level roles. With decades of experience across natural resources, regional development, agriculture and strategic planning, Imants brings both historical perspective and future-focused thinking, including insights into special economic zones and what they could mean for Australia's growth. Please join me in welcoming Imants Kins.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you very much, Romy, for inviting me to make a presentation here today. I'm the co-chair of Australians for Northern Development and Economic Vision, and I want to pass on the best wishes of the chairman, Mrs. Gina Reinhardt, and wishes you well, and unfortunately she wasn't able to attend. ANDEV was established about August of 2010. Basically, it's a small group of private sector people who are very passionate about the development of Northern Australia, and there was a gap. There's a serious gap in terms of the political appreciation of the importance and the relevance of Northern Australia to all of Australia, and that's the fundamental reason why we were set up. So today, as has already been said, I want to take kind of a big picture view on how did we get to where we are today in terms of our standard of living, our living standards. And we can say quite unequivocally that we live longer, we live healthier, we have much wider range of choices than ever over the recorded 2.5 million years of human history. So how did this something, improvements in living standards, come into existence from nothing? Now, what's really fascinating about this question is that fundamentally it's only the trend, the increase in living standards has only occurred over the last 200 years. So basically there's been no change in living standards for millions of years. And then when there was a move into settled agriculture about 10,000 years ago, there was emergence of towns and cities leading to new occupations and the export of goods from inside an area to outside areas. Now, there were sort of diseases and wars from that period of settled agriculture up until 1820, which resulted in the general trend in living standards not improving at all. So something significant happened in 1820. Now, one of the things that is often forgotten is that there were what I would call social innovations that occurred, particularly in the UK, from about 1750 to about 1820. And these social innovations are the acceptance of private property, patent law, independent courts, and a legal system, and public health improvements like sanitation. And it was not until after 1900 that life expectancy, which was then around 30 years of age, began to exponentially rise to what it is today. Life expectancy generally in developed countries is 70 to 80. Now this is only 126 years ago, roughly 350 generations where we've had this exponential growth in living standards. You can see from the graph, I mean, it's almost becoming kind of perpendicular when you look at it, you know, from 1 AD to where we are today. And so if you look at the 2.5 million years of human history, over 97% of humanity's wealth was created in just the last 0.01% of our history. Now that's a very, very long time. And as I've noted before, life, generally speaking, until probably the last couple of 100 years, has been brutal and short. And someone living in 1750 was closer to someone living in Greece in 1 AD than to their grandchildren living in 1850. And we today generally live better and longer than the kings and queens of history. So because we're talking about living standards, we're talking about the economy. And the word economy gets thrown around as if, you know, we all seem to know what it is. But let me give you a definition. And it's important. It's important to have this definition. The economy is an evolution of a self-emergent human exchange system that has created wealth from the Stone Age to today. And the key words are self-emergent human exchange, meaning a free as possible market system. I'm one of the boomers and an economist, and I am on a daily basis in awe of how the market economy works. You know, there's no kind of one person sitting up there making the economy work, and it generally works seamlessly, silently, and productively if it's left on its own. And I think that's a very important point, if it's left on its own. You know, one of the things, how do people choose their professions? How does the whole economic system work? It's quite mysterious and kind of magical and beautiful in a way. And the successful economies allow its citizens to work this all out amongst themselves with minimal government interference. Generally, governments react to the past, whereas the private sector, like you guys, is focused on now and the future. And it takes risks with its time and money and discovers something out of nothing. It innovates and creates. And the glue that makes it mysteriously work is trust. Trust between us all, and this trust is led by the superpower of commerce between strangers. Now, money is an example. Now, you can tell I'm a boomer. This is a piece of paper, and we all accept this in exchange for goods and services. There's an underlying trust in this. And these days, of course, this is disappearing. We're all going digital. Now, historically, the indicator or marker of wealth has taken many different forms. And I'm going to read from The Wealth of Nations, 1776, by the Scottish professor of moral philosophy, Adam Smith, who's generally regarded as the father of economics. And this is his quote, and you'll be interested in this first one. He says in 1776, "In the early ages of society, cattle are said to have been the common instrument of commerce, though they must have been a most inconvenient one. Salt was the common instrument of exchange in Abyssinia, species of shells in coastal part of India, dried cod in Newfoundland, tobacco in Virginia, sugar in some West Indies colonies. And there is a village in Scotland where it is not uncommon, I am told, for a workman to carry nails instead of money to the baker's shop or the alehouse." So history tells us clearly that wealth is not a fixed concept. And as I was saying before, You know, we have bitcoins and tokens, digital tokens. So the world is certainly becoming a very difficult, not a difficult place, but a different place in terms of how we measure wealth or how we indicate wealth. And I also wanted to refer to Marco Polo. In 1300, he wrote a book called The Travels of Marco Polo. He lived in China for 17 years, between 1271 to 95. Now, he was incredulous that Chinese people accepted mulberry bark banknotes cut into different sizes, dyed, stamped with official signatures and seals of the Kublai Khan in exchange for goods and services. Now, how far can rulers, governments go in making sure their rules are followed? Well, here is an extreme. If traders refused to accept the banknotes, they were executed. So Europe was at this time and for many centuries at a far lower level of economic, cultural and social development than China. And one of the funny things about Marco Polo when he came back to Europe in 1300, he shocked Europeans by saying, you know, in China, they actually wash their hands before they eat. In Europe, nobody washed their hands before they ate. So speaking about China, you might be asking why the Industrial Revolution only occurred in the UK, those 200 years ago. It's innovation, it's the private sector, it's people taking risks. And there being an institutional structure that's catalyses risk-taking. So the market fundamentally is really, really important. In the UK, between 1750 and 1820, we had inventions like the steam power, steam engines, coal mining. Textile production exploded with the invention of the power loom and the spinning jenny. We had a marine chronometer, wrought iron, telegraph, and also steel production. Now, for centuries, this is an interesting point. For centuries up to the 16th century, China had been the most developed and innovative nation with many inventions, like gunpowder, porcelain, paper money, compasses. Now, what changed? The Chinese rulers at the time stopped the free emergent human exchange, the economy, that had led to numerous innovations and discoveries, because they were antagonistic towards the thriving commerce and merchant business class, the entrepreneurs. It was said that commerce did not fit into the values of what are sometimes called the poet emperors and its elites. Now, this is a warning. What we assume as permanent can suddenly change as rulers, governments can stop developments and improvements in living standards. The private sector has to be on guard to protect and nourish the expression of human endeavour that drives the economy forward and improves living standards. So what does drive a successful economy? I've already hinted at it. It's driven by the human endeavour, and that human endeavour being as unfettered as possible so that the human imagination can discover innovations and foster entrepreneurship. That's really, really important. So how is wealth created? It's because people like you, who over the last 200 years have taken risks and created businesses. The private sector generates the taxation from people like you that provides all of the services delivered by government: health, education, transport, defence, social welfare, safety nets. Governments generate no wealth. They take part of the wealth you create in the form of taxation and redistribute your wealth back into the society through numerous programs and service delivery agencies. So the proposition I would put to you is the government's main role, through the power citizens grant them in a democracy, is to create a context or structure that can foster and act as a catalyst, for its citizens to grow wealth and thereby improve the nation's living standards. It's what Adam Smith called in 1776 in his book, The Wealth of Nations, business people acting from enlightened self-interest that, yes, creates wealth for the risk taker and brings benefits to the whole of society. And I'll speak about this further on when I speak about special economic zones. Now also, let me put to you a generally unheard of proposition on the economy and how it works. Not all dollars are the same. Some dollars are more important, some dollars are more productive and have a greater impact on economic growth than others. Dollars created in the private sector by businesses, and in particular export industries, have the largest multiplier impact on the economy, and thus I would say are more important. If the Australian economy was just focused on the domestic market, which is comparatively small by world standards, living standards and economic growth would be very much lower. Today, it would be reasonable to say that without agriculture and resources sectors exports, Australia could well be a third world country. So let me return to an important point a word I used before, which is multipliers. And this is a word that's rarely heard from governments, is actually often not used anymore in economics curriculums, and certainly not used by the Commonwealth bureaucracy when it comes to economic issues and their macroeconomic modelling. And I congratulate the Northern Territory government and the cattle industry that the concept and use of multipliers is well known, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So in a very simple way, the multipliers measure the direct and indirect effect of revenue generated by a specific company or an industry. And the ABS has in its annual national accounts, it includes these input-output tables, which once were used to calculate multipliers. But in 2001 and 2, the bureaucrats decided that the multipliers was basically being unused. And my take on that would be that they regarded it as being somewhat dangerous, that people should be talking about multipliers, because then they might start to understand exactly how the economy works, and that not all dollars are the same. Now, in terms of the multiplier, now most industry sectors like retail, medical, entertainment, transport, construction are dependent on revenues generated in other sectors, in other industries. Now, for example, the export, if you're exporting like the cattle industry is, you're bringing in income that's coming from either governments or people living in other countries. It's fresh income that's being injected into the economy. A long time ago, I did employment and population forecasts in Western Australia for all the regional statistical divisions, and I used what's called a base methodology, which basically says that regional development is based on export industries. And I saw from that work, which basically was required me to meet with all of the companies that were exporting in all those different areas, understand their current workforce and their future plans, and then make projections on employment and population. And I really understood in real time how important the export industries are to the regional industry. So let's have a look at the cattle industry in the Northern Territory as an example. An industry founded by pioneers. It's a difficult climate. You have annual floods and bushfires. Sacrifices have to be made by the families. You have to be resilient, and you have to be really committed. And I take my hat off to all you here and to all your forebears in the way you've developed Northern Australia, and in particular the Northern Territory. And you are incredibly significant contributors, not just to the Northern Territory economy, but because of the multiplier effect to all of Australia, all of Australia. I mean, the exports that you earn, because of the way it flows through the economy, could in fact be providing income for the hairdresser or, for the chemist. That's the way that money gets flowed through the economy. And there was an excellent report produced by ACIL Allen in August of 2022, which was commissioned by Live Australia? The MLA and Live Corp, which actually was using the input-output tables and developed the economic impact of the Northern Territory on the Northern Territory economy and also the Australian economy. And your Northern Territory Primary Industry and Fisheries annual economic review provides output multipliers as well. Now, based on those two reports, and I'd recommend if you haven't read it, that ACIL Allen report is excellent. That I would estimate that, and the figures that we used then, that's based on 2020 and 21. The estimate there is that between 1.5 billion and 1.96 billion is the total economic impact of the Northern Territory cattle industry. Now today I reckon that's going to be well over 2 billion. And I'd suggest that given the importance of the cattle industry, that study done by ACIL Allen could well be updated. So let's just summarise the answer to that question: how do we get to where we are today? One, it's through imagination, creativity, innovation and endeavour of people in the private sector. Two, that for living standards to improve, human endeavour must generally be as unfettered as possible so that the human imagination can discover innovations, foster entrepreneurship and bring risk investment from private sector into the economy. Three, not all dollars are the same, as is proven in multiplier analysis. And four, risk-taking is a key driver of the improvement in living standards through wealth creation and reinvestment of that wealth. So my second question is, what do we do now? As an economist, it's well known that investment drives production and consumption tomorrow. Investment today drives production and consumption tomorrow. And in this area, there's a real need for special economic zones. And I did speak about this at the Bush Summit in Darwin last year, and there was great acceptance at that Bush Summit that there is a need for special economic zones, and certainly the Northern Territory could well be Australia's first special economic zone. The special economic zones are very, very important in terms of attracting economic development and particularly investment, both domestic and overseas investment. And the fact that Australia is now ringed by special economic zones in all of our neighbouring countries, and Australia is fundamentally becoming uncompetitive as an investment destination because of all these different special economic zones that have been established around us. Now, these special economic zones can take on different names like free trade zones, export zones, integrated development zones. So what are their general characteristics? First point, a designated area that has differential policies in regards to taxation, be it federal or state. A streamlined regulation system, and we've already heard today about the NTCA's work on reducing regulation and red tape. and there's a need for one-stop shop processing of all government approvals. So here we need a Herculean effort in the sense that we need local, state and Commonwealth governments to be acting as one government. It does happen around the world. I can't see why it can't happen here in Australia. Now, guess what? There are roughly around about 8,000 of these special economic zones around the world. How many have we got here in Australia? Zero. Zero special economic zones in Australia. So these special economic zones have become foundational in the world to promote economic development. So from the graphic you can see 75% of nations have special economic zones. 88% of the world population live in nations with special economic zones. And it's just extraordinary. It's just extraordinary that we can't have one here in Australia. It's just beyond me. The greatest success of special economic zones has been in China, when Deng Xiaoping set up in 1978 its first special economic zone in southern China in Guangdong province to attract investment and manufacturing. That was the foundation of China's growth. Today it has over 2,500 special economic zones, and they're creating new innovative ones almost on a daily basis. There is a special day in the calendar, the Chinese calendar, where they celebrate special economic zones. And we know, certainly Australia's prosperity since the 80s has been very much dependent upon China. And that Chinese growth has generally been driven by, interestingly enough, the introduction of, shall we say, the market system into China. Deng Xiaoping did it in at the late 70s into the agricultural sector, where he introduced the price mechanism into agricultural production, and production went through the roof, incomes increased. And these special economic zones are just totally market-driven, totally market-driven. And China still continues to use the market system. And, it even has, shall we say, private sector companies that run cities and that run these special economic zones. I mean, the province or the county has the overall authority, but they employ private sector to run these special economic zones. So yeah, it's bizarre. It's bizarre and deeply disappointing that Australia just doesn't have any of these. And ANDEV has been banging on about this since 2010. And unfortunately, regardless of the political classes or political parties, they just seem to be tone deaf when we start talking about what is fundamentally a desire to make Australia competitive again, to bring in investment, to create more jobs, to create more incomes, and so that we have more taxation to pay for all the requirements that we need. So how can I bring this back to the Northern Territory cattle industry? Now you guys have a very strong comparative advantage compared to other locations in the world. You've got large scale grazing land, proximity to major markets, efficient production, incredibly efficient production, and world-leading cattle health management. I mean, seriously, that you guys are leaders in the world in terms of this, in terms of the efficient production and the health management of your cattle. So shouldn't the government have in place policies to bolster and support this industry with a special economic zone policy? So not just that it retains its competitiveness, but it strengthens its competitiveness. Why can't there be, for example, in a special economic zone with taxation changes, providing incentives to make the industry even more competitive? So this could well be a framework within which also to look at other issues that your industry may face, like, for example, labour shortages and the numerous Commonwealth taxes that are imposed upon you. I think I read somewhere there was about $73 a head is the cost of the various Commonwealth taxes that are placed upon you to run your businesses. So while I don't have a detailed magic special economic zone for you today, I can say without doubt the cattle industry and Australia should have such a policy. And I would also call for a Northern Territory and Commonwealth Government joint audit of the level of services which exist in the cattle industry in the Northern Territory, and for that to be benchmarked against the level of services in a capital city, say Brisbane, Adelaide or Perth, and a major regional centre. That study should also address the key issues facing the cattle industry and the agricultural industry in Northern Australia, including infrastructure and supply chain challenges, water access and security, workforce labour and social constraints, and the reduction in red and green tape. So I think all these things could be included in this audit, and I think the audit is very, very important because, you know, you get various kind of studies coming out showing, for example, the absence of certain services for you guys in the Northern Territory, and particularly in the remote areas. But there's no overall measure to benchmark how the deficiencies in those services. But if you benchmark it against a city or even a regional city, you can actually measure what needs to be done, and you can put in place policies to alleviate that. So the purpose of the study would be to use its findings to develop a funded program to bring the level of services up to the benchmark, and that could be incorporated in a special economic zone or implemented independent of the special economic zone. And I'll just finish off by talking about the tax offset policy, the ZTO. This was introduced in 1945, rightly, to acknowledge the hardships in terms of running a business living in Northern Australia. And it provided tax offsets. And fair enough, because it's a high cost place to live and work, so it's fair to be compensated for that. Now, that ZTO hasn't been updated for decades. And of course, the Productivity Commission recommended in its 2020 report to completely cancel the ZTO. Currently, the ZTO, if you're living in a special area, which is a very remote area, you get $1,173 tax rebate. If you live in Zone A, like a remote town area, you'll get $338. And if you live in a larger regional location, you'll get $57 off your tax. Now, at a minimum, the ZTO must be increased to $5,000 for special area A, $1,000 for Zone A, and $350 for Zone B. That's just to take into account the rise in consumer price index. So my conclusions. How do we get to where we are? 1, living standards are generally determined by the ambition and endeavour of people in the private sector. 2, risk-taking creates improvement in living standards through wealth creation. 3, not all dollars in the economy are equal. 4, Australian governments must incentivise investment through the establishment of special economic zones to improve business competitiveness, sustain and grow living standards. Now, this can happen in the Northern Territory. This can happen specifically related to the cattle industry. And there's a need for an audit of the level of services, particularly in the Northern Territory, remote areas and the cattle industry in particular. And 5, increase the zone tax offsets. I'll just finish off by saying The future is not out there somewhere. It's actually here today and being created by all of us. So I wish you all well.
Just one quick question. Why do you suppose successive Commonwealth governments have been so reluctant to investigate special economic zones?
The big hurdle has been Federal Treasury. Federal Treasury basically say that if you're going to introduce special economic zones with the differentiated taxation, that's going to cut the overall tax take. But every single study around the world shows that if you introduce these special economic zones, you get more investment, you get more jobs, you get more businesses, you actually increase the tax take. You actually increase the tax. And, it's the macroeconomic models that they use. It's called these equilibrium models that they use in Treasury in Canberra. Every dollar is regarded as the same. So the dollar that comes from taxation that ends up being spent on, let's say, for example, defence or whatever, it's regarded as having the same impact on the economy as the dollar that comes from exports that you guys generate. Now, the multiplier effect is completely different. The economy doesn't work that way. And you know, we've had the best. Certainly the coalition has been very positive about it, but they've always run into they get advice from Treasury in Canberra that says, no, don't do it, it'll set a precedent, And then, of course, they throw up the furphy about the Constitution. And, you know, there's a section of the Constitution that doesn't allow differentiated policies in terms of trade between the states. But we've got this ZTO. The ZTO has been around since 1945, and no one's challenged it. No one's challenged that ZTO. And one of the reasons why the Northern Territory is the perfect spot for this first special economic zone in Australia is because territories are not mentioned in the Constitution. They're not mentioned in the Constitution. You guys have got a free palette. Let's have a special economic zone in the Northern Territory.
Thank you.